I found the photograph at an estate sale in Baltimore, Maryland. It was a Saturday in May, one of those perfect spring days when the city shakes off winter and the harbor sparkles in the sunshine. The estate belonged to a retired nurse who had died at age 98, leaving behind a house filled with decades of nursing memorabilia and medical history. Most buyers at the sale were interested in the antique furniture and jewelry, but I was drawn to a collection of old photographs and documents related to nursing history. Among them was a large photograph, perhaps 11 by 14 inches, showing a group of nurses and a doctor posed outdoors. The photograph showed 11 people, 10 women in nursing uniforms with distinctive white caps and aprons, and one man in a white medical coat who appeared to be a doctor or administrator. They were arranged in 2 rows, with some seated and others standing, in front of trees and what looked like a brick building. One of the seated nurses held a small dog. It was exactly the kind of photograph you'd expect from an early 20th century hospital. A formal portrait of medical staff, documenting the professional women who cared for patients and the physician who supervised them. What caught my attention was a small notation card that had been tucked behind the photograph in its frame. The card was yellowed with age, and the handwriting was shaky, as if written by an elderly person. St. Margaret's Hospital, Baltimore nursing staff, and Dr. Raymond Holbrook. June 1910. Do not let this photograph be destroyed. It is evidence of what he did to us. Someone should know the truth. Sister Mary Catherine, 1967. I stared at those words. Evidence of what he did to us. Someone should know the truth. This wasn't just a routine hospital portrait. This was a document of something dark, something that needed to be preserved and understood. The estate sale coordinator noticed my interest. That photograph came with a box of Sister Mary Catherine's papers, she said. She was one of the nurses in the image, became a nun later in life. The box is over there if you want to look through it. I bought the photograph and the box of papers for $300, my hands trembling slightly as I carried them to my car. That evening in my hotel room, I carefully examined everything. The box contained letters, a journal, medical records, newspaper clippings, and various documents spanning from 1910 to the 1960s. Sister Mary Catherine had apparently spent decades documenting and researching what had happened at St. Margaret's Hospital in 1910. On the back of the photograph, in the same shaky handwriting as the notation card, was written, "Back row, left to right. Nurse Elizabeth Morrison, Nurse Sarah Bennett, Dr. Raymond Holbrook, Nurse Margaret Wilson, Nurse Catherine O'Brien, me, Nurse Dorothy Chambers. Front row, left to right. Nurse Rose Murphy, Nurse Ann Sullivan, Nurse Helen Kowalski, Nurse Ruth Goldstein, Nurse Florence Chen. All 10 of us were victims. We stayed silent for too long. I began reading through Sister Mary Catherine's journal, which she had apparently started keeping in 1956, almost 50 years after the events she described. From Sister Mary Catherine's journal, dated March 1956. I am 72 years old. I have been a nun for 40 years, having entered the convent in 1916 after leaving nursing. I have lived a quiet life of prayer and service, trying to atone for my silence, trying to forget what happened at St. Margaret's Hospital. But I cannot forget. And as I approach the end of my life, I feel compelled to document the truth about Dr. Raymond Holbrook and what he did to the 10 nurses in his care in 1910. I stayed silent for too long. We all did. Fear, shame, and the power dynamics of the medical profession kept us quiet. silence protected him and allowed him to continue his work unchallenged. Now I will write what I should have spoken decades ago. In 1910, I was 26 years old and working as a nurse at St. Margaret's Hospital in Baltimore. Nursing was still a relatively new profession for women, and we were expected to be obedient, modest, and absolutely deferential to physicians. Dr. Raymond Holbrook was the hospital's chief of medicine. He was 42 years old, highly respected in the medical community, and known for his research into women's health issues. He was charming, educated, and seemed genuinely dedicated to advancing medical knowledge. He selected 10 of us, the 10 nurses in the photograph, to participate in what he called a special research study into women's physiology and health. He told us it was a great honor to be chosen, that we would be contributing to important medical advances, that our participation would help countless women in the future. We were flattered. We were excited to be part of important research. We trusted him completely. That trust was a mistake. I read on, my sense of dread growing with each page. Sister Mary Catherine described how the research study had begun innocuously enough. Basic health assessments, questions about their menstrual cycles, routine physical examinations. But gradually, the examinations became more invasive, more frequent, more disturbing. From Sister Mary Catherine's journal, April 1956, Dr. Holbrook told us he was studying the effects of various compounds on women's reproductive health and overall constitution. He said he was developing new treatments for women's ailments, menstrual irregularities, nervousness, hysteria, infertility. He began giving us injections, weekly at first, then twice weekly. He said they were experimental hormonal compounds that might revolutionize treatment of women's health issues. We all experienced side effects. Some of us developed severe headaches. Others experienced nausea, dizziness, irregular bleeding. Ruth Goldstein developed tremors in her hands. Florence Chen began having vivid nightmares and periods of confusion. When we reported these symptoms to Dr. Holbrook, he was unconcerned. He said they were temporary side effects, necessary for the research, that we needed to be brave for the advancement of medical knowledge. He kept detailed records of our symptoms. Later, I would understand that he was documenting the effects of his experimental compounds on human subjects. We weren't participants in research. We were test subjects. But at the time, we didn't fully understand what was happening. We were young women in a profession that required absolute obedience to physicians. We had been trained to never question a doctor's judgment. And Dr. Holbrook was so confident, so authoritative, so seemingly concerned with our well-being, even as he harmed us. I found medical records that Sister Mary Catherine had apparently obtained or preserved. They documented the treatments administered to the 10 nurses between January and October 1910, from Dr. Holbrook's research notes obtained by Sister Mary Catherine in the 1920s, study of experimental compounds on female subjects. January, October, 1910. Subjects: 10 female nurses, ages 22-31, all in good health at study commencement. Objectives: to test various experimental hormonal and chemical compounds for their effects on female physiology, with particular attention to reproductive function, nervous system response, and behavioral changes. Compounds administered: various combinations of ovarian extracts, thyroid preparations, adrenaline compounds, and experimental synthetic hormones of my own formulation. Results: Subject 1, EM. Developed severe headaches, hypertension, eventual kidney damage. Subject 2, SB. experienced amenorrhea, weight loss, nervous tremors. Subject 3, MBMW, manifested extreme anxiety, insomnia, cardiac irregularities. Subject 4, CO, exhibited menstrual irregularities, emotional instability, temporary vision problems. Subject 5, DC, suffered from persistent nausea, fatigue, eventual thyroid dysfunction. Subject 6, RM, developed severe migraines, fainting episodes, possible seizure activity. Subject 7, AS, experienced profound mood changes, severe depression, 1 suicide attempt. Subject 8, HK, manifested muscular weakness, tremors, difficulty concentrating. Subject 9, RG, exhibited hand tremors, anxiety. Menstrual cessation subject, DIC 10men FC, suffered vivid nightmares, periods of confusion, potential neurological damage. Notes: all subjects have shown responses to the experimental compounds, providing valuable data about the effects of hormonal manipulation on the female system. Side effects, while unfortunate, are acceptable given the scientific knowledge gained. I felt sick reading these clinical descriptions of women who were being systematically harmed. These weren't patients receiving treatment. They were healthy young women being used as experimental subjects without proper consent or understanding of the risks. Sister Mary Catherine's journal continued. By summer 1910, all 10 of us were experiencing serious health problems. Anne Sullivan attempted to kill herself in July. The despair and mood disturbances caused by whatever Dr. Holbrook was giving us had become unbearable for her. She survived, but was sent away to recover, and we were told not to speak of the incident. That was when some of us began to question what was happening. We began talking to each other quietly, comparing our symptoms, realizing that we were all suffering similar effects. In August, Elizabeth Morrison approached Dr. Holbrook and said she wanted to stop participating in the study. He became angry, not overtly, but in a cold, controlled way that was more frightening than rage. He told Elizabeth that she had committed to the research, that she couldn't simply withdraw because she was experiencing minor discomfort, that the advancement of medical science required sacrifice. When Elizabeth insisted, Dr. Holbrook threatened her. He said that if she withdrew from the study and spoke about it to anyone, he would ensure she never worked as a nurse again. He said he would tell hospital administrators that she was unreliable, unstable, mentally unfit for nursing work. Elizabeth stayed. We all stayed. What choice did we have? Dr. Holbrook controlled our careers, our reputations, our futures, and we had been trained our entire professional lives to defer to physician authority. The photograph in question, the one I now owned, had been taken in June 1910, in the middle of this period of systematic abuse. From Sister Mary Catherine's journal. The photograph was taken in June 1910. Dr. Holbrook arranged for it to be made, said it would document our participation in his important research project. He wanted us to look professional, healthy, dedicated, to create an image of respected medical professionals engaged in valuable work. I look at that photograph now, and I see what wasn't visible at the time. I see Elizabeth Morrison in the back row, already suffering from the headaches and kidney problems that would plague her for the rest of her life. I see Sarah Bennett, who had already lost 20 pounds from the nausea and appetite loss caused by the compounds. I see Dorothy Chambers, exhausted from insomnia, barely able to stand for the photograph. In the front row, I see Anne Sullivan, just weeks before her suicide attempt, already descending into the terrible depression that the experimental treatments had caused. I see Helen Kowalski, her hands positioned carefully to hide the tremors. I see Ruth Goldstein, whose shaking hands would force her to leave nursing within a year. And I see myself, Catherine O'Brien, age 26, standing in the back row in my nursing uniform, my nursing cap perfectly positioned, looking directly at the camera. I look healthy. I look professional. I look like someone engaged in important medical work. But inside, I was suffering. The injections Dr. Holbrook was giving me had caused menstrual irregularities, emotional instability, and episodes where my vision would blur and darken. I was frightened, but I said nothing. I smiled for the photograph. I maintained the appearance of the dedicated nurse. That photograph is a lie. It shows 10 healthy nurses and a respected physician. It conceals 10 victims and their abuser. I found newspaper clippings documenting what had happened when the truth finally began to emerge. From the Baltimore Sun, November 12th, 1910. Allegations of improper medical experiments at St. Margaret's Hospital is investigating allegations that Dr. Raymond Holbrook, the hospital's chief of medicine, conducted unauthorized medical experiments on nursing staff. The allegations were brought to hospital administrators by several nurses who claim they were given experimental injections without proper understanding of the risks involved, and that these injections caused significant health problems. Dr. Holbrook has denied any wrongdoing, stating that the nurses participated voluntarily in legitimate medical research and were fully informed of the nature of the treatments. Hospital administrators have stated that they are conducting a thorough investigation and will take appropriate action based on their findings. From the Baltimore Sun, December 3rd, 1910. Dr. Holbrook resigns from St. Margaret's Hospital. Dr. Raymond Holbrook has resigned his position as Chief of Medicine at St. Margaret's Hospital amid ongoing controversy about his research practices. While hospital administrators have not released details of their investigation, sources indicate that Dr. Holbrook conducted medical experiments on nursing staff that resulted in health problems for several women. Dr. Holbrook has issued a statement saying that he resigned to pursue other opportunities, and that the allegations against him are the result of misunderstandings about his research. He maintains that all subjects participated voluntarily and with full knowledge. The nurses involved have not spoken publicly about the matter. From Sister Mary Catherine's journal, the hospital investigation was a sham. Dr. Holbrook was allowed to resign quietly, with no admission of wrongdoing, no disciplinary action, no reporting to medical authorities. The hospital was more concerned with avoiding scandal than with protecting us or holding Dr. Holbrook accountable. They wanted the matter to go away quietly, with minimal damage to the hospital's reputation. We were pressured to remain silent. We were told that if we spoke publicly, we would be seen as unreliable, emotional, hysterical, all the negative stereotypes about women that were used to dismiss our concerns. We were told that our nursing careers would be over if we made trouble. So we stayed silent. We accepted the harm that had been done to us. We watched Dr. Holbrook leave the hospital, with his reputation largely intact, free to continue practicing medicine elsewhere. And we lived with the consequences. Elizabeth Morrison's kidney problems became chronic. She died in 1928 at age 44. Sarah Bennett never fully recovered her health and died young. Dorothy Chambers suffered from thyroid problems for the rest of her life. Anne Sullivan was never quite the same after her suicide attempt. I left nursing in 1916 and entered the convent, partly from religious conviction, but partly from a desire to escape the world where such things could happen. Many of the others left nursing as well, unable to continue in a profession where they had been so thoroughly betrayed. Dr. Holbrook continued practicing medicine. I tracked his career over the years. He moved to Philadelphia, then to New York, always maintaining prestigious positions, always respected in the medical community. He died in 1942, at age 74, having lived a long, successful life, despite what he had done to us. The injustice of that haunts me still. I found more documents, letters Sister Mary Catherine had written to medical authorities and women's organizations in the 1920s, trying to draw attention to what had happened. Most of her letters were ignored or dismissed. From a letter by Sister Mary Catherine to the American Medical Association, dated 1925. Dear Sirs, I am writing to report serious ethical violations by Dr. Raymond Holbrook, currently practicing in New York City. In 1910, when Dr. Holbrook was chief of medicine at St. Margaret's Hospital in Baltimore, he conducted unauthorized medical experiments on 10 nurses, including myself. Dr. Holbrook gave us injections of experimental compounds without proper consent or understanding of the risks. These experiments caused significant health problems for all 10 women involved. Several of us suffered permanent health damage. One woman attempted suicide as a result of the psychological effects of the experimental treatments. When these abuses were discovered, Dr. Holbrook was allowed to resign quietly, with no disciplinary action. He has continued practicing medicine and conducting research with no accountability for his actions. I am writing to request that the American Medical Association investigate Dr. Holbrook's conduct and take appropriate disciplinary action to prevent him from harming others. Sincerely, Sister Mary Catherine O'Brien. From the AMA's response, dated February 1926. Dear Sister Mary Catherine, we have reviewed your letter regarding Dr. Raymond Holbrook. However, without corroborating testimony from other witnesses, and without access to medical records documenting the alleged experiments, we cannot pursue an investigation based solely on your claims. We note that these alleged events occurred 16 years ago, and that at the time, no formal charges were filed, and no official finding of wrongdoing was made by St. Margaret's Hospital. We therefore cannot take action in this matter. Sincerely, Signature American Medical Association. Sister Mary Catherine had tried repeatedly to bring attention to what had happened, but in the 1920s and 1930s, a woman's testimony, especially about events from years earlier, carried little weight against a respected male physician. I found one more important document in the box, a letter written by Sister Mary Catherine in 1967, shortly before her death. It was addressed to whoever finds this photograph and these papers. Dear friend, if you are reading this, you have found the photograph of the 10 nurses and Dr. Holbrook from St. Margaret's Hospital, June 1910. And you have found my documentation of what he did to us. I am 83 years old now. Of the 10 nurses in that photograph, only 3 of us are still alive. Elizabeth, Sarah, Dorothy, Anne, Helen, Ruth, and Rose have all died, some young, some after long lives, but all of them carrying the effects of what Dr. Holbrook did to us in 1910. For 57 years, I have lived with the knowledge that we were victims of medical abuse and that our abuser faced no real consequences. For 57 years, I have regretted my silence, wished I had been braver, wished I had fought harder for justice. But I was young, I was powerless. I was a woman in a world controlled by men, a nurse in a profession where questioning a doctor could destroy your career, a victim in a time when women's testimony was rarely believed. I did what I could. I documented everything. I kept the photograph and added my notation, ensuring that anyone who looked at it would know it was evidence of something dark. I wrote letters trying to bring attention to what happened. I preserved medical records and testimonies, but I couldn't force the medical establishment to care. I couldn't make authorities investigate. I couldn't get justice for myself or for my 9 fellow victims. So instead, I leave you this evidence. I leave you our story. And I hope that in your time, whenever that may be, women's testimonies about abuse are taken more seriously than they were in mine. What happened to us was not unique. Medical research has often used vulnerable populations as test subjects without proper consent or care for their well-being. Women, the poor, prisoners, racial minorities, all have been exploited by physicians and researchers who prioritized scientific advancement over human dignity. My story and the story of my 9 fellow nurses is just one example of this pattern. But it deserves to be told. We deserve to be remembered not just as anonymous nurses in an old photograph, but as real women who were harmed and whose testimony was dismissed. Tell our story, honor our memory, and work to ensure that such abuses cannot happen in your time. With prayers for your work, Sister Mary Catherine O'Brien. March 1967. Sister Mary Catherine had died in October 1967, 6 months after writing that letter. The photograph and papers had apparently been kept by her order, and eventually made their way to the estate sale where I'd found them. I spent the next year researching the case extensively. I found medical records confirming the health problems Sister Mary Catherine had described. I found records of Dr. Holbrook's career, confirming that he had indeed continued practicing medicine with no apparent consequences. I tracked down descendants of several of the nurses and interviewed them about family stories they'd heard. What emerged was a clear picture of medical abuse, a physician using his authority to experiment on vulnerable women, causing them significant harm, then escaping accountability through institutional protection and the dismissal of women's testimony. I wrote a comprehensive account of the case, using Sister Mary Catherine's documentation and my own research. The book was titled The 10 Nurses, Medical Abuse and the Silencing of Women's Testimony in Early 20th Century America. The book generated significant discussion in medical ethics circles and among historians of medicine and nursing. The case of Dr. Holbrook and the 10 nurses became an important example in teaching about informed consent, patient rights, and the historical exploitation of vulnerable populations in medical research. The photograph became central to the story. Looking at it with knowledge of what it really represented, not dedicated medical professionals, but victims and their abuser, transformed its meaning entirely. I received many letters in response to the book. Some were from medical ethicists and historians, but one letter particularly moved me. It was from the granddaughter of Ruth Goldstein, one of the nurses in the photograph. Dear Dr. Morrison, thank you for telling my grandmother's story and ensuring that she and the other nurses are finally recognized as victims of medical abuse rather than as anonymous faces in an old photograph. I remember my grandmother's hands. They shook constantly, tremors that she'd had since she was a young woman. She told me once that a doctor had given her medicine that made her sick, but she never provided details. She seemed ashamed, as if it had been somehow her fault. Reading your book, I finally understood. The tremors were caused by Dr. Holbrook's experiments. The shame was the result of a system that blamed victims rather than perpetrators. My grandmother left nursing in 1911, shortly after leaving St. Margaret's Hospital. She married, had children, and lived until 1968. But she was never quite healthy, never quite the same as she might have been if a doctor hadn't used her as a test subject for his experimental compounds. The photograph you feature in your book, I have a copy of it that was passed down in the family. I've looked at it many times over the years, seeing my grandmother as a young woman in her nursing uniform, looking professional and capable. Now I see her differently. I see a victim of medical abuse, a woman who was harmed by the very profession she'd joined to help others. I see someone who deserved justice and protection, and instead received neither. Thank you for ensuring that the truth is finally known. Thank you for honoring these women's testimonies, even though the medical establishment of their time dismissed them. Sincerely, Rachel Goldstein Morrison. The photograph now hangs in my study, displayed alongside Sister Mary Catherine's notation card and excerpts from her journal. Together, they tell the complete story of what really happened at St. Margaret's Hospital in 1910. I look at that photograph often, at the 10 nurses and Dr. Holbrook, posed in front of trees on what appears to have been a pleasant summer day. The nurses look professional in their white uniforms and caps. Dr. Holbrook looks dignified in his white coat. They appear to be respected medical professionals, documenting their work together. But the photograph captures something darker. 10 victims and their abuser. 10 women being systematically harmed through unauthorized medical experiments. A physician exploiting his authority and their trust to advance his research at the cost of their health and well-being. The photograph was taken in June 1910, in the middle of the period when Dr. Holbrook was conducting his experiments. By that time, all 10 nurses were experiencing serious health problems from the experimental compounds he was giving them. But they smiled for the camera. They maintained professional appearances. They stayed silent about what was being done to them. It would be months before some of them found the courage to speak up. And when they did, they were pressured into silence. Their testimony was dismissed, and their abuser faced no real consequences. The photograph looked innocent, just a routine hospital portrait, documenting medical staff in 1910. But it was actually evidence of systematic medical abuse, preserved by one of the victims who spent 57 years trying to ensure the truth would eventually be known. May Sister Mary Catherine O'Brien rest in peace, honored finally for her courage in documenting and preserving this story. May Elizabeth Morrison, Sarah Bennett, Margaret Wilson, Dorothy Chambers, Rose Murphy, Anne Sullivan, Helen Kowalski, Ruth Goldstein, and Florence Chen be remembered as the victims they were, not as anonymous nurses in an old photograph. And may Dr. Raymond Holbrook be remembered by history not as a respected physician, but as an example of how medical authority can be abused and how institutions protect powerful men at the expense of vulnerable women. The photograph looked innocent, but it captured 10 victims and their abuser, documented medical abuse that went unpunished, and preserved evidence that one brave woman ensured would not be destroyed. That's the truth Sister Mary Catherine wanted someone to know. That's the story she spent decades preserving and documenting. 10 nurses, 1 doctor, secret experiments, systematic abuse, silenced testimony, unpunished crimes, all captured in one photograph from June 1910, looking innocent on its surface, but hiding a terrible truth beneath. The photograph looked innocent, until the doctor's secret experiments were uncovered, and the 10 nurses were finally recognized as the victims they had always been.